Good morning, everyone. I'm Tamiko Brown-Nagin, Dean of the Harvard Radcliffe Institute, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you in person and online to our 2024 Gender Conference titled Gender and Politics, Navigating Power and Perception. Our program began yesterday with a keynote conversation with Massachusetts Governor Maura Healey. It was inspiring and thought-provoking, and a recording will be available on Radcliffe's website in the coming weeks for those of you who missed it. Today, we'll continue our exploration of the intersection of gender and politics through a series of multidisciplinary sessions featuring current and former office holders, activists, journalists, and scholars. As many of you may know, the Radcliffe Institute traces its origins to Radcliffe College, founded in the 19th century to give women access to a Harvard education at a time when the university wouldn't admit them. Today's institute carries that legacy forward in our enduring commitment to women and the study of gender, as well as our dedication to advancing opportunity for all, and to fostering the exchange of ideas across different disciplines, different perspectives, different life experiences. We do so through public programs like today's convening, through our renowned interdisciplinary fellowship program, and through Radcliffe's Central Library on the history of women in America. In fact, it's especially fitting that this year's Gender Conference focuses on gender and politics. The archive that would become the Central Library began in 1943 with a collection on women's suffrage activism. Much has changed since then. Globally, women's participation in politics has increased, including in elective office. According to the United Nations, women serve as heads of state or government in 26 countries as of January 2024. The US has also seen progress towards greater representation in government. Vice President Kamala Harris is the first woman and the first Black and South Asian woman to be elected to office. There's also a record number of women serving in Congress, in state legislatures, and in statewide elective executive office. And across the United States, over 1,100 openly LGBTQ people have held elective office in 2023, a nearly 165% increase since 2017. These are important strides, yet much work remains to be done, as I reflected yesterday at our opening keynote session. Though the number of women in political office has increased, these gains have been slow and vary across nations. As of January 2023, women accounted for just 26.5% of members in national parliaments. And as I underscored yesterday, women also remain underrepresented in elective office in the United States, where they comprise about 28% of Congress and 33% of state legislatures. And fewer than 1% of elected officials in the US were known to be LGBTQ+ in 2023. Now, these figures represent just one dimension of an analysis of gender and political engagement, as my colleague at Harvard Kennedy School, Pippa Norris, and others have written. Beyond formal political institutions, people participate in politics through community organizing and other forms of civic engagement. As I and other scholars of social movements have noted, these are critically important facets of democracy, particularly for those once excluded from and still underrepresented in formal politics along lines of race, gender, and other intersecting aspects of identity. Today's conference, therefore, examines gender and politics broadly, from formal institutions like elective and appointed office to grassroots political engagement, As we explore those different modes of participation and representation, our speakers will consider the important questions of power and perception that arise, including barriers to political involvement that traditionally underrepresented gender groups face, as well as the challenges that persist for those in office. Now, let me provide a brief overview of our program. Our first session today will consider how to get there, examining the intersection of gender and individuals' decision to engage with politics, as well as their experiences doing so. Then, our second session will focus on how to make one's voice heard in politics, after which we'll break for lunch. And I want to note that for those who are attending in person, boxed lunches will be available in the Coolidge Room on the first floor of this building, the Knaufel Center. We'll then reconvene for the final session of the day, which will unpack media and gendered narratives. As I noted earlier, these sessions' distinguished speakers include activists, journalists, scholars, and current and former elected office holders, and I'm grateful to them for sharing their insights and their expertise. Beyond these sessions, at various points in the program, we'll also hear about the experiences of 3 trailblazers from the field. Ruth Z. Louijean, president of the Boston City Council and Boston City Councilor at Large. Dallas Ducar, chief executive of Trans Health. And Rochelle Walensky, former director of the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. We welcome your thoughts and questions throughout the program. Whether you're watching us in person or online, you can submit questions using the Slido link provided on the screen behind me and posted in the chat feature of the Zoom webinar. The moderators and speakers in each session will address as many questions as they can. We'll start our program in just a minute, but first let me offer some thanks. I'm grateful to the Women in Public Policy program at Harvard Kennedy School for co-sponsoring this convening. Thank you especially to faculty co-director Iris Bonet, Albert Pratt Professor of Business and Government, to Executive Director Nicole Carter-Quinn, and to the entire team at the Women in Public Policy program. Iris Bonet was also a faculty organizer of today's conference, alongside Sarah Bleich, Vice Provost for Special Projects at Harvard, Professor of Public Health Policy at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, and Faculty Director of the Social Sciences Program, and Carol Forsheimer Professor here at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. I'm grateful to Iris and Sarah for all their efforts. I also want to thank Rebecca Wasserman, Executive Director of Academic Ventures and Engagement at Radcliffe, Jessica Vicklin, Director of Events, and their entire teams, as ever. Let me also recognize the members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and all our dedicated annual donors whose generous support keeps Radcliffe's lectures, conferences, exhibitions, and collections free and open to the public, and we thank you. I also gratefully acknowledge the Perrin Moorhead Grayson and Bruns Grayson Dean's Leadership Fund for Academic Ventures, which is supporting this event today. And finally, let me reiterate many thanks to all of today's speakers and moderators and express my gratitude to all of you in our virtual and in-person audiences for joining us. With that, I'm pleased to kick off our program with our first trailblazer from the field, Boston City Council President and Boston City Councilor at Large, Ruth Z. Louijean. Born and raised in Boston, Council President Louijean was first elected to the Boston City Council in 2021. In her first term as City Councilor at Large, she led the city's redistricting process and served as chair of the Committee on Civil Rights and Immigrant Advancement, and as vice chair of the Committee on Government Operations and the Committee on Housing and Community Development. Now in her second term, she was unanimously elected council president in 2024. She is the first Haitian American elected to Boston municipal government and the first Haitian American to serve as council president. As a lawyer, and housing advocate. She represented families in Boston Housing Court and helped to obtain funding for first-generation homeowners as a member of the Massachusetts Affordable Housing Alliance. In addition, she worked on voting rights cases heard by the U.S. Supreme Court, helped to elect progressive prosecutors across the country, and was the senior attorney on Senator Elizabeth Warren's presidential campaign. Council President Louis Jean is a graduate of the Boston Public Schools, of Columbia University, of Harvard Law School, and of Harvard Kennedy School. Please join me in warmly welcoming Boston City Council President and City Councilor at Large, Ruth C. Louis Jean, to the stage. Thank you so much. Good to have
you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Professor Brown-Nagin. When I was a student at Harvard Law School, I believe you had come in during my third or fourth year, and I never got to take a class with you, but I'm just grateful for your leadership and the way in which you are continuing to have an impact at Harvard on issues at large, so thank you. Thank you for this wonderful invitation to the Radcliffe Institute. I am Ruth C. Louis Jean, President of the Boston City Council and at-large City Councilor. I'm so grateful to so many people, including Professor Brown-Nagin mentioned them, but just also wanted to say thank you again to Becky Wasserman, to Jessica Vickland. I see some of my colleagues in service here. I see Rep. Wynn here, so thank you. I don't know who else is here, but I know that there are some other folks who will be coming, and so I just want to thank all of everyone who's here. So to all the distinguished guests and esteemed colleagues, it's an honor to be here with all of you and to stand before you today as we delve into a topic many of us understand too well, the intersection of gender and politics, to think about what politics and perception, to think about power and perception. Those are things that I think about every day, even when I'm not actively thinking about them. You know, I'm still relatively new as the principal, as the elected in the world of politics. I'm only in my third year, and I try to remind people of that when, things are coming at me fast. And there's a lot to learn. And one of the biggest things is that, and I don't dwell on this actively too much because there's just too much work to get done, but how some things would be a lot easier if I weren't a Black woman in politics, if my identity were different. When we talk about the time that we're in, it's just an incredibly difficult time to be in public service, to be in elected office, given the deep divides in our society and given the role of social media. But it is one that is really a sacred privilege to be able to do the work of representing residents in the city of Boston. The Boston City Council is now majority woman, and I feel like we should clap for that. Because I think we take it for granted now, because this is, I believe, the second or third iteration of the City Council where it has been majority woman, and if you come into the chambers at Boston City Council, you will see pictures from the early 1800s of the former presidents of the council, of the former councils, where it's just white men for a very long time. And I am the third Black woman to serve as the president of the Boston City Council, after Andrea Campbell, after Kim Janey. And I am the third Black person to serve in that role, and it's all in recent history, but sometimes we only think about recent history, and we don't think about the people that made my position possible and how we are still fighting these fights for gender parity. Oh, I see another state rep in the house. I wanted just hello. The Boston City Council is where I'm learning to cut my teeth in politics. As was stated in my bio, I've worked before in elected politics, but never, it was not my face that had to be front and center, and that is a different experience. On my own personal reflection in my journey in politics, I believe that through it all, one constant has remained, that my gender, along with my race, shapes the way my voice is heard and perceived in the political sphere. Even prior to that, as an attorney, there were so many instances where when I was working in Boston Housing Court, representing folks facing eviction and foreclosure, where the opposing counsel thought that I was actually the client and not the attorney. I remember when I was working on the first federal ranked choice voting recount in Maine, and there was opposing counsel then who knew that I was the senior attorney, but who refused to engage with me and instead engaged with my colleague who was my junior, a white man. And no matter what I would try to tell him and say, you go through me, I'm the senior attorney. Finally, my junior had to say, if you have questions, you have to talk to my senior attorney. And I think that's really important when we talk about allyship for the men in the room, how important it is to use your positions of power and the privilege that you have and have been given to make sure that you're creating space for women and making sure that women are able to prosper in leadership roles. I stand on the shoulder of giants here in Massachusetts, from pioneering figures like Doris Bunty, who served as the first Black woman elected to the Massachusetts legislature, to leaders like Senator Elizabeth Warren, Attorney General Andrea Campbell, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, Mayor Michelle Wu, and Governor Maura Healey, who I believe you heard from yesterday. These women have played an integral role in shaping our democracy and have contributed to the legacy of women leaders that continue to come after them, including myself. I see myself, even when I talk about being the third Black woman to serve in this role, the fifth woman to serve in this role, I see myself as part of a continuum, and that my work is not complete if I am the last woman or if I'm the last Haitian person to serve in this role. We have so many names to be proud of, so many names that we commit to memory, so many giants on whose shoulders we stand, who we can name. But something I always like to talk about in whatever space is about attempt. I want to think about the legacy of those whose names we don't know and who history books have excluded. The ones who tried to become politicians and public servants but couldn't because of sexism and racism. They too are an important part of our legacy, and they shape the perception of women in politics as well. These are the women who are not only the unrealized politicians, they're the unrealized doctors, the unrealized engineers, the unrealized actresses who never got to explore the depths of the gifts that they had. We would not be here without those who have tried and made it, those who have tried and come up short, and those who continue in the struggle. We owe an enormous debt to those who have come before us, and the best way to pay back that debt is to continue in their legacy. In talking about attempts, I always talk about how attempt can be legacy. Many of you may be familiar with Dorothy Height, an African-American civil rights and women's rights activist. She focused on the issue of African-American women, including unemployment, illiteracy, and voter awareness. She's credited as the first in the civil rights movement to recognize inequality for women and African Americans as that intersectional problem that should be considered as a whole. She was a president of the National Council of Negro Women for 40 years, and she was once said, "I want to be remembered as one who tried." That's really powerful because to try does not always mean to succeed in the way that we typically understand it. But we have to reframe how we think, especially as women who have had barriers placed in the way of that success. It is important that we honor those attempts, even if those aren't the attempts that are given the perceptions of power. Sometimes the legacy and the success is in the attempt itself. Toni Morrison was once asked, how do you survive whole in a world that has been trying to take you down? And she says, sometimes you don't survive whole, you survive in part. But the grandeur of life is in that attempt, not necessarily the solution. And I think about that a lot as someone who carries a lot in this role, that I have the privilege of representing as the first Haitian American in this role. Boston has the second largest per capita Haitian diaspora in all of the United States. And as for anyone paying attention to the news right now, Haiti is in a really big state of instability. 80% of the capital is controlled by gangs. If you want to read more about it, I have an op-ed in the Globe today about it. And I think about the weight of all of this, and that to not be overwhelmed by that weight, but to understand that even the attempt is part of that work. We know that, unfortunately, despite the visible and admirable progress we've made in the past decade, there are still barriers for women seeking to enter and thrive in public office. From implicit biases and systemic discrimination to the relentless scrutiny of the media, the road to political leadership is often fraught with obstacles that disproportionately affect those who do not conform to the traditional mold of a politician. Since the inception of the United States Senate, there have only been 58 women who have served as senators. I will never forget when I was a student at Harvard Law School, and we had a forum that brought in women legislators from Afghanistan after we had been participating in rebuilding the Afghani government. And I remember that because of the systems that we were intentionally putting in place, the percentage of women in Afghanistan in the legislature was higher than the percentage of women here in Congress, which I think goes to show you that we have not done the work either through society or through the mechanisms of ensuring that women were strategically placed to be in positions of power. And because of the limitations, because of our current Supreme Court composition, our ability to really make those strides in more effective manners have really been limited. And I was very happy, of course, for the strides that Afghanistan were making, and was just really disheartened by our failure here to really find ways to center women in positions of power. The House of Representatives, the number paints a similarly bleak picture. Since the first woman, Jeanette Rankin of Montana, was elected in 1916, a total of approximately 345 women have served in the House. I share these stats as reminders that gender disparities persist despite the progress that has been made in recent decades, and we have a lot of work to do. I think a lot about how we navigate this landscape, I think one of the reasons we want to see more women in power is because women think more communally, and we think about communities and people as a whole, and we try to really center that. We have to cultivate a culture of inclusivity and empowerment within our political institutions. This means actively dismantling the barriers that women face and making sure that we are supporting those who are trying to come up. I spend a lot of my time talking to young women who want to get into politics, and I think that it's imperative of me to do so, and to also paint the blessing that it is to serve and the challenges that they will face as women. I am still learning, as I said, in my third year, and I listed the women who are leaders in politics as well, because I learn a lot from them, and I learn a lot from their leadership. Politics can be a world in which you are they want you to think just about yourself and your own advancement. But if we are really thinking about using politics as a mechanism for bending that moral arc towards justice, we think about the collective. So in this job, in thinking about the collective, when we are thinking about our communities and we're centering women more, we will do the work of politics, which is not about ego, which is not about self-interest or what you can get for yourself. It's about what you can get for your community and what we can do together. I'm really honored to be in this role, and I'm really honored to be considered a trailblazer in this field. I was at an event last night at the Boston Public Library. I was honored as the children's champion from Family Aid, and my parents were there. It was a Family Aid event. I was like, let me bring my family. So I brought my mother and my father, and I think about how all the lessons I learned about how to be a politician. Harvard Law was great, Harvard Kennedy School, all of that. Bio stuff is fine. But at the root of it, I am where I am because of my parents, who taught me that the greatest calling is to be each other's keeper. And so as we work to get power, because power is how you build the change and how you bend that moral arc towards justice, may we remember the reasons why we are in this, and it is to be each other's keeper. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Ruthie. That was really wonderful. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of this conference. My name is Sarah Bleich, and I serve as the Faculty Director for Social Sciences here at the Radcliffe Institute, and I'm also the Vice Provost for Special Projects at the university, and on faculty at the Chan School and the Kennedy School, as you heard from Dean Tomiko Brown-Nagin. We are thrilled to see all of you here in person and online, and online, excuse me. And I wanted to acknowledge the co-director of this conference, as you heard, Iris Bonet. Unfortunately, she can't be here in person because she is receiving an honorary degree from the University of Zurich, but she is very much here in spirit, and you will hear from her on video right after the lunch break. So I want to move us into the first panel for today, and as you heard from Dean Tomiko Brown-Nagin, the focus of this panel is How do you get there? How do you actually get into politics? And so we have the privilege of being joined by Jennifer Lawless. She's the Leon Reeves and George W. Spicer Professor of Politics. She's a professor of public policy at the University of Virginia. Jennifer has expertise in political campaigns, elections, media, and politics. And her remarks will be followed by a moderated conversation. So please join me in welcoming Jennifer to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I should tell you in advance, I'm having leg issues, so I might have to sit at some point, but I'm only gonna talk for 15 minutes, so if all goes well, we're good to go. Okay, thank you very much. I am thrilled to be here, and like the other speakers we've already heard from today, it's very easy to look at the United States and look at high-profile women in politics and see all the progress that's been made. Whether we're talking about women of color who have recently been elected to Congress, whether we're talking about Nancy Pelosi schooling Donald Trump in a cabinet full of men, whether we're talking about Liz Cheney running a hearing that most people would say was unlike any we've ever seen in US history, Elise Stefanik grilling various college presidents, Marjorie Taylor Greene making herself known at the State of the Union address, or Kamala Harris serving as Vice President of the United States. We've reached a point in time where whenever you turn on the TV, whenever you look at your screens, whenever you're listening to a podcast, it seems, we have high-profile women in politics. That shouldn't obscure, however, the numbers that we've already heard about today. The reality is that the overwhelming majority of our political institutions are still dominated by men. This is the case in the US Senate, it's the case in the US House of Representatives, it's the case in state legislatures across the country, and even when we're talking about executive leadership in large cities. These numbers are important not only because we see that our political institutions are still male-dominated, but because if we continue on this track, we're not going to find gender parity in the United States Congress until 2108. And so these numbers represent records. These numbers highlight a lot of progress that the United States has made, but in context, they demonstrate also how much progress still needs to be made. And because all of my remarks were basically already taken up this morning by the speakers who did a better job than I just want to note that the United States currently is in a four-way tie for 71st in terms of the percentage of women serving in the national legislature globally. To put this number into perspective, when I started studying women's representation and women in politics in the fall of 1999, we ranked 57th. Now, we've made a lot of progress since then. There are more than twice as many women serving in the US Congress now than there were then. But many more nations have progressed at a much faster rate than we have. Okay, so why is this the case? There are several explanations out there, some of which are compelling, some of which are not so compelling. I'm going to briefly summarize them, and then I'm going to highlight the explanation that I think we can actually do something about. The first has to do with the candidate pipeline. The reality is that traditionally, women were not found in the professions from which most politicians come. They weren't lawyers, they weren't business leaders, they weren't occupying positions in higher education or in political activism. As women became more likely to enter those professions and those careers, they also became more likely to run for office. But this takes time, and professional career segregation is sticky. And so a lot of people have a relatively optimistic view that as women slowly continue to take hold in these feeder professions, we'll see more women occupy positions of political power. And in fact, that has been the case. We have seen this steady trickling up, and that largely is a result of women having the credentials that we expect in politicians. A second barrier has been the incumbency advantage. 90% of incumbents seek re-election. 90% of incumbents, even when we have a vote them out mentality, win re-election. This is even the case when they're mired in scandals of their own. And the overwhelming majority of our elected officials are men. So if 90% of our incumbents seek re-election, and they're almost all men, and 90% of them win, and they're almost all men, then the opportunity for previously excluded groups becomes very, very difficult and pretty slow. And so given the incumbency advantage, it's hard to imagine a huge jolt to the system. We're gonna have to be patient. Then there's the bias explanation. And here, the good news is that systematically, when women run for office, they fare just as well as men. Whether we're talking about primaries or general elections, whether we're talking about Democrats or Republicans, whether we're talking about Congress, the state legislature, or local offices, there's no systematic bias against female candidates in terms of vote shares, vote totals, or fundraising. Now, That's not to say that episodes of bias don't exist, that there aren't certain cases where women don't win elections, probably because of explicit bias on the part of voters, where women sometimes have a harder time raising money. But systematically, there isn't much evidence to suggest that women find themselves at a disadvantage, and that's good news. A perfect example of this, I think, is if we look at the most recent election returns. In 2008 and 2012, Barack Obama won about 90% of Democratic voters, and John McCain and Mitt Romney won about 90% of Republican voters. If there was systematic bias against female candidates, then when we look at Hillary Clinton's outcome in 2016, she should have done a worse job than Barack Obama, and she didn't. She also won about 90% of Democratic voters, and Donald Trump won about 90% of Republican voters. She also won the popular vote, which I think we tend to forget. So this, again, is not to say that some women don't face bias in electoral politics. It's not to say that there aren't card-carrying sexists out there whose mission in life is to make it difficult for women who want to enter politics. But systematically, we've reached a point in time where, overall, women are doing quite well. So why is it that we have so few women? Well, some people would say that it's because women have to navigate a more complicated playing field than men. And one of the best ways to highlight that is Joni Ernst's shoes. So when Joni Ernst delivered the response to the State of the Union address several years ago, she wore camouflage heels as, paying homage to her time in the military. And there was more media coverage of her shoes than there was the speech. There was the major faux pas when Elizabeth Warren and Amy Klobuchar had the audacity to both wear a red blazer on the same debate stage. That merited quite a bit of commentary. We should be stunned to find out that Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez actually pays to have her hair look good. But for every conversation that we hear about Joni Ernst's shoes, I think a lot of the time we forget that, there was the audacity of taupe. Barack Obama was heavily ridiculed for having, the audacity to wear a taupe suit at the podium. Chris Christie has said that there's been more commentary about his weight than anything else. And when we think about Donald Trump and the headlines and Donald Trump's hair and his appearance, it's hard to make the case that he's been inoculated against these kinds of criticisms. In fact, this is my favorite thing. GQ, the magazine, had an interactive feature where you could make Donald Trump look more presidential. And so you could actually go online, you could change his hair, you could change the length of his tie, you could give him a handkerchief in his suit. And so, you can imagine if they did this to a woman, it would be completely unacceptable. So in some ways, we've achieved a sense of progress here. This is not to say that media coverage is high quality, but it is to suggest that men and women are equally susceptible to this terrible coverage that's out there. So, again, bias is probably, there are episodes of it, but systematically it doesn't seem to be disproportionately affecting women in politics. Just as a highlight, Bernie Sanders' hair, Pete Buttigieg's ties, and Joe Biden's glasses. And then I would be remiss not to close with Ron DeSantis' boots. So again, not high quality coverage, not necessarily what we should be focusing on when we think about elected officials, but perfect examples of men being ridiculed the same way. Okay, so given the incumbency advantage, given the political pipeline, given no evidence of systematic bias against women, why is it that we're still trailing? And the argument that I would make here is an argument that I've been making for 20 years, which just seems impossible to me because I'm only 38. I'm not, but you can't tell. So in the summer of 2001, Richard Fox, who's a professor at Loyola Marymount University, and I decided that something seemed wrong with the political system where even then the studies were finding that there was no bias against female candidates, but women were still so underrepresented in politics. And we were also a little put off by these rosy prognoses about how, well, women just have to be patient and everything's gonna fix itself. And so what we did was we conducted a national survey of potential candidates. These are women and men who occupy the professions that are most likely to lead to a political career, so law, business, education, and politics. And we asked them, have you ever considered running for office? Do you think you're qualified to run for office? Has anybody ever encouraged you to run for office? We wanted to test the premise that if we're patient, things are gonna get better. And these men and women on paper were exactly the same. We interviewed and we surveyed about 4,000 of them that year. Then we did follow-up interviews with 300 of them on the phone. And the women and men, if you looked at their CVs, you would not be able to tell the difference. They were equally likely to be college educated. They all worked in the same professions. They had similar levels of income. They had similar levels of political interest. And what we found was a substantial gender gap in political ambition. Even though these men and women looked very similar on paper, women were 16 percentage points less likely than men to say that they had ever considered running for office. They were 50% less likely than men ever to have done any of the things that are typically required of a political candidate, like investigate how to get on the ballot, or think about how much money it would cost to run, or talk to your family members or friends. So we thought, all right, the prognosis is probably not exactly accurate. Fast forward 10 years, a lot had changed. It's 2011. So at this point, Hillary Clinton had given Barack Obama a run for his money. Nancy Pelosi had become Speaker of the House. Sarah Palin was a vice presidential candidate. And the gender gap in political ambition was exactly the same size. We were pretty stunned. So then in 2021, this is 20 years after the initial study, we said we'll do it again, and this is when we get to close up shop, because the gender gap in political ambition has obviously gone away. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. Kamala Harris is vice president of the United States. We have twice as many women serving in Congress now as we did in 2001. The percentage of women in state legislatures in 20 years has increased by 50%. And the gender gap in political ambition was exactly the same. I should note also, the gender gap in political ambition among people under the age of 40 was the same size as it was among people over the age of 60. It was the same size regardless of race or ethnicity. It was the same size regardless of whether you were married or unmarried, whether you had children or no children, whether you were responsible for the majority of the household tasks or not, whether you were responsible for the majority of childcare or not, regardless of your profession. And our survey of college students found that the gender gap in political ambition among college students was actually 20 percentage points. So it is very, very sticky. Why is this the case? Well, the first reason has to do with the fact that women and men who have the exact same resumes do not think about being qualified in the same way. Now, this is not a shock. There's a huge interdisciplinary literature that has made this clear. But what really is stunning here is that these are women who have already overcome a lot of traditional socialization barriers to exceed expectations and thrive in high-profile male-dominated professions. These are lawyers, business executives, political activists. Yet even among those women, we're seeing substantial gender gaps in qualifications. The gender gap in qualifications was actually bigger in 2021 than it was in 2001. The other thing I would note about this is that it's not that women are necessarily underestimating their qualifications. It could very well be that men are overestimating their qualifications. We asked in a lot of these interviews, well, what do you think makes you qualified, or why do you think you're not qualified? And men think they're qualified when they have passion or vision for something. That must be a nice way to live life. Women think they're qualified when they have 4 advanced degrees, political experience, deep pockets, and an infrastructure that's going to support them to run for office. The other thing is we found that both women and men thought that women often had to be twice as qualified to get half as far and to compete evenly because of perceptions of bias on the campaign trail. It's great that when women run for office, they do as well as men. It's great that when women try to raise money, they're able to do it. And it's great that media coverage, at least in congressional races, looks very similar for men and women when it comes to volume and substance. But if no one knows that, does it really matter? I mean, sure, it matters, but if the perception out there is that there is systematic bias, it's very difficult to knock that out. The other thing that was interesting here is it's not just these broad senses of qualifications. Notice that women are far more likely than men to think someone like them would have a hard time running for office, to doubt that they have thick enough skin. They believe their looks would be criticized, and they question whether they know enough about public policy to thrive. So both in terms of these broad overall assessments, but also specific traits and credentials, women are less likely than men to believe that they have what it takes. Interestingly, there were no gender differences when it came to whether they actually had credentials and experiences that were politically relevant, like fundraising experience or public speaking experience or organizing in their communities. The second main reason has to do with the recruitment gap. Women are less likely than men, even when they exist in the same professional and occupational circles and have achieved the utmost levels of career success, to receive the suggestion to run for office by any political gatekeeper, whether it be a political activist, an elected official, or a party leader. They're also far less likely than men to receive the suggestion to run for office from family members, colleagues, spouses, or members of the clergy. Both of these are hugely important because when you think you're qualified to run, you're far more likely to do it. And when somebody encourages you to run, you're far more likely to do it. But women are far less likely than men to have that profile. And I just want to conclude by sharing with you one brief anecdote and then a slide to hammer that home that I hope can guide the way that we think about this moving forward today. When we're talking about recruitment and qualifications, I often think about two people that we interviewed when we did the book. One day I interviewed this woman and asked if she had ever considered running for office and if anybody had ever suggested it. And she said no, and she was adamant about it. And midway through the interview, she told me a story about how she had recently had a meeting with the mayor of her town. And she had the meeting because she was interested in reforming an education policy. So she goes, she meets with the mayor, and she gives him her idea. And he explains to her that although he's on board, and although the school board is on board, the way that education policy is run in this area involves the city council. And the city council, the mayor, and the school board sort of operate as a trifecta. So she needs to sway the city council. But there's good news. There's an open seat, and he thinks she should run for it. Now remember, she's telling me the story. He thinks she should run for it, and he'll put her in touch with people who could help her campaign. So I said, wait a minute. You just said that nobody ever suggested that you run for office and that you've never considered it. And she said, oh, I'm not qualified to do that. He wasn't serious. Okay, pause. Literally the same day, I love when this happens, I did another interview with this guy, and I asked him the same questions, and he said, oh, it's funny timing. I was actually recruited to run for office last week. And he was a business executive. I mean, he had the profile of a candidate. And I said, tell me what happened. So he tells me this story about how he's at O'Hare Airport, and he's waiting for his flight, and it's delayed. So he goes to a bar at the airport, and CNN is on, and he starts, I guess, offering political commentary along with the pundits on CNN. So when he gets up to leave, the bartender says to him, you know a lot about this. You should run for office. Now, I am not suggesting that women are being recruited to run all over the country and don't realize it, or that the typical male candidate is recruited at his local watering hole. However, even if the truth is somewhere in between that, I do want you to see this final slide. It's hard to see, but basically these were different scenarios where we asked people, would you be more likely to consider running for office if? And the factor that encouraged the most people to run was the top one, if a representative from the Democratic or Republican Party encourages you to run. 19% of men and 11% of women said that that would make them more likely to run. Now, the gender gap there is substantial and significant, but it does mean that we could up women's interest in running for office pretty substantially if we did that. But the reason that I want to bring this back to the anecdote I just showed you is the most effective message could potentially move 11% of women. 11% of men would be more likely to run if a coworker told them they needed more women in politics. 10% of men said that they'd be more likely to run after a conversation with an acquaintance. And 9% said they'd be more likely after listening to a speech that encouraged everyday Americans to run for office. What this means is that we have to be more strategic and more systematic in encouraging women to run for office. We can't just cast a wide net. We should still do that. It's going to affect some women, but we also have to target them. And let me just conclude by saying that we've made major progress when it comes to women's numeric representation. That's undeniable. We haven't made progress when it comes to closing the gender gap in political ambition. And I think moving forward, it's important to decouple those two concepts. With targeted recruitment, with identifying a handful of women to run for Congress, a few dozen women to run for the state legislature, we can make substantial gains. But if we actually want true gender parity, true gender equity, and true inclusivity, then the idea of running for office has to be just as likely to appear on a woman's radar screen as a man's, even if ultimately neither he nor she decides to give it a shot. So thank you very much.
All right. Hi, welcome everybody, and welcome to the panelists. I'm Graciela Martinez. I'm a resident fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's IOP. And as you know, by the way, Jennifer, that was fantastic. That was amazing. But in addition to Jennifer, who I will not reintroduce, we've also got Tram Nguyen, who is also a Massachusetts state representative from the 18th Essex District. You can read more about her bio in the website links. And then we're also joined virtually by Sarah Guillermo, Chief Executive Officer of Ignite. And these women all bring an incredible depth of experience in this, and we're going to dive into some of these things that Jennifer just laid out for us, which is pretty incredible. But I'm going to start with an opening question to Sarah. Can you hear me, Sarah? Hi. So I love that we ended on this note, which actually is really about Ignite's work, Sarah. You know, your work has been built around solving some of the challenges that Jennifer just laid out, some concrete solutions to that, especially challenges related to building this ambition that she just talked about. And you've done exceptional work with training women around this, over 35,000 women so far through Ignite's programs. But talk to us about some of what Ignite is doing to address these challenges.
Yeah, thanks for having me virtually, everybody. Happy Friday. I'm so excited to be here with all of you. I think that there's a lot to think about in terms of building this ambition gap. So Ignite started back in 2010, and we've been really solving a lot of the challenges that Jennifer raised, really thinking about what is the ambition gap starting at even the middle school and high school age. And then a lot of our work is really centered around shifting culture precisely so that young women and girls see themselves as political leaders and embrace their ambitions at an early age. And back in 2016, when we thought we were going to celebrate the first female president, we had done a video with Amy Poehler's Smart Girls that was titled "We All Belong Here." And it was a young girl that was about 8 years old, really talking about all of the different things that she needed to hear from her community in order to feel like she could be president one day. And so I think it's all the things that we're doing, even at the most earliest stages. And so a lot of what we can aspire to really needs to be modeled. And so what we're seeing in the classroom, what we're seeing at home, what we're seeing in our community, and this representation is so critical. I grew up with a household full of phenomenal women that really showed me what it was like to use my voice at a very early age. And so I think as we start to unlock the next generation's imagination about what's truly possible for them. And I think what we're doing in our classrooms, online, in college campuses across the country, are three core things. One is really demystifying what does politics and like civic engagement look like, and what are the entry points to get there. Right now, we are moving from our target audience of millennials to Gen Zers, and so really understanding what's the path for Gen Zers given the current ecosystem that they are growing up in. Two, addressing specific barriers that young women are facing from running from office, like finances, imposter syndrome, lack of knowledge, and the lack of networks that they need. And then finally, we have to change the big national conversation that we're having around politics and the way that media and culture portrays young women's political ambitions so that we can normalize that as a society. So if you can see it, you can obviously start to think that you can actually be it.
Amazing, thank you. And as folks already heard, there's going to be a panel later today on the media narratives aspect of this, but I suspect it'll probably appear in some of the conversation that we're having on this panel. I want to follow up on some of this, so I want to go to Trom. You were an attorney, advocate, grassroots organizer, so when we're talking about entry points, and Jennifer mentioned this as attorney also being as one of those main entry points. So before you even ran for office, you had done a lot of work in that area and were essentially a political leader without being an elected leader. And so were those paths what led you to run for office, or was the idea kind of already there? And then also too, I loved, Jennifer, that you were pointing out about challenging incumbents, because Trom, you actually did challenge an incumbent when you decided to run for office. So tell us a little bit more about your path.
Well, thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm really thrilled to be here, especially because I'm a student at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I've been thinking about gender and politics a lot. And Jennifer, thank you for that presentation. It reaffirmed a lot of what I went through. I got into office in I got elected in 2018 and took office in 2019, and I did challenge an incumbent. But if you had asked me, 10 years ago, whether I would ever think about running for office, the answer would have been no. And I think that what you highlighted in your study is exactly true. No one asked me. No, I didn't see anyone who looked like me in elected office. And in fact, when I got elected in 2018, I was the very first Vietnamese American woman to ever get elected to any office in the Commonwealth, and the second Asian American woman to ever, or third Asian American woman to ever get elected into the State House. And so I highlight all these colleagues first because it was 2018.
Yeah.
Like, how is that possible? And, and we're talking, my colleague here, the city councilor president, like she's being the first Haitian American woman as well. And so I didn't think about running for office, but I was very lucky in that I was in a profession where I had the ability and opportunity to engage with politics in ways that others wouldn't. And so I had helped out several of my friends and colleagues who had run for office. So I was somewhat familiar with the political process, which is key in all this, because I saw how they were able to do it and the day-to-day, which kind of broke it down, like the mystique of it all, to allow me to realize, oh, this is very doable for me. So that was number one. And the other piece was I was encouraged by my colleagues to run for office. In fact, when I was an attorney with Greater Boston Legal Services, I was representing survivors of domestic violence, veterans, people with disabilities, and other vulnerable people. And in doing that work, not only did I represent them in the courtroom, I also helped work on policy, some of which you might have heard about, paid family medical leave, an increase in minimum wage, et cetera. I'm also a union member as part of UAW. And so in doing all that work, I saw the power of policy and how it could be so helpful to people and how bad policy or a lack of policy could really hurt them. And then I found out that my own state representative wanted to allow police officers to stop anyone who looks illegal. That was actually a bill that he filed. And as someone who did civil rights work and care about building a welcoming and inclusive community for all, I realized that I should just stop complaining about the representation and actually took him on as a challenger. And so I challenged an incumbent who was in office for 8 years. And I wouldn't have been able to even, I would not have thought that I was qualified if it were not for my colleagues really pushing for me and letting me know that not only am I asking you to run, but this is how we will help you. And they laid out a plan for me. And I think that that is the intentional piece that we need to think about. It's not just about being in office. One of the barriers, and I think a barrier in my mind, and perhaps other women can identify, or non-binary people can identify with this as well, is that I'm not just thinking about how do I win this race, but how do I do this work after, right? And so we need to talk about the intentionality of the support system put in place. And frankly, I don't have any children, but I've talked to several of my colleagues who do. It's a lot of work, not only being a candidate, but also being an elected official. And so women think very much ahead as we plan our lives for the next 5-10 years. And it's daunting to think about, like, how can I manage this? Would I be able to balance all of this? And so that was why I never thought about running for office before until I sat down with others who've been in office, who've done the work, and have served as my mentor to really help me understand that this is something that can be done.
Yeah, no, and I think that what you mentioned about support systems is so important. And not only in kind of getting there or initially, but then staying there and moving up that ladder. I know, Jennifer, we've talked about some of the political infrastructure that exists in terms of how people can get there or what ways people get approached, recruitment efforts. Can you talk a little bit more about how do you help kind of penetrate some of those efforts in terms of getting more women to run to office on the recruitment front? How do you solve for some of those gaps that you identified earlier on?
Sure. I think there are several different kinds of women's organizations, all of which are doing incredibly important work, but that also underscore how many different dimensions there are that require the work. So there are some organizations, especially Emily's List, for example, where if you're a pro-choice Democratic woman, an endorsement from them and then ultimate support from them, whether it means bundling contributions or putting you in contact with other people that can be helpful, is vital and is key. They have a hugely high success rate, but part of the reason is because it's very difficult to get an Emily's List endorsement. Yeah. It's very difficult to be one of the candidates that they identify as it's worth bundling contributions for you. And that's certainly the case as you go higher on the career ladder. So there's no question that we need organizations that are going to support women who decide to run, but we also need organizations like Ignite, like Emerge America, which is also on the Democratic side of the aisle, to encourage women to think about running and to show them what running would entail, even if they're not ready to run right now. The one caveat I would have here, and I've spoken to a couple of people about this, Stephanie Shriak, who was the previous president, and Emily's List, and I talked about this one day. I do worry a little bit that we're basically putting women on this candidate training hamster wheel. And given that women are already more likely than men to doubt their qualifications, we keep throwing like new trainings at them, new programs at them, and then they're like, oh, I need 7 more, I need 17 more, I need 46 more to acquire every single credential and every single qualification. And so I do think that we have to be a little bit careful about, in some ways, sort of like feeding the beast. But the existence of these organizations and the idea that we're now sort of moving into an arena where you can get help from organizations like this, even if you're not ready to take the plunge right now, is vital and is important. The one other thing I would say is college campuses vary in how they address this issue. There are a lot of them that have ready-to-run programs. There are many who have civic engagement components. What I will say is our research found that the gender gap in political ambition among high school students and first-year college students was a lot smaller than it was among graduating college students. So we call it the freshman dorm effect. Basically, as you navigate the college experience, you sort of sort back into pretty traditional gender roles and pretty traditional gender expectations, which flies in the face of everything I think we would think about what college is supposed to be. But in a lot of ways, it could be the result of the fact that when you're in high school, your goal is to get into college. Most, a lot of kids, about 90% of young people say that that's their main goal. So they want a well-rounded background. They want to look a lot like each other in terms of being competitive to get into school. They want to take varsity. They want to play varsity sports. They want to have leadership positions. They want to do, Model UN, all of these things. When they get to college, they know they achieved the goal. They then sort of sort back into maybe what they think they're supposed to be doing in the first place. And so I think we need to be more active on college campuses to at least refute that idea. I see it in my own classes. When I teach a women in politics class, I have about 60% women, 40% men. This semester, I'm teaching everything you should know about US politics and we're afraid to ask. And it's overwhelmingly men. And when I teach campaigns and elections, it's overwhelmingly men. And so once they take those classes, that sort of sets them on a path for continuing to take those classes and continuing to get the experiences that we need. So when we think about recruitment and encouragement, I think we have to think more broadly than just political actors, women's organizations, and leaders.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad you also raised the point about kind of training and this paradox of kind of you have to be qualified, right, to run for office, when very rarely, as we know, we don't see men making those same kind of judgments in terms of what they consider those qualifications. But Sarah, I wanted to come back to you on this. Can you talk a little bit about this piece, especially because you do work with Gen Z women so much and trying to close some of that gap, but also we've talked about Gen Alpha women, right, the women that are going to come after this current generation. But talk a little bit about what you see when you are talking to these young women and how maybe reframing some of these things in your training makes the difference and as they continue to go on in their trajectories.
Yeah, I was like burning to say a couple things after what Jennifer just shared. I have a Gen Alpha. I have one right next to me and then one upstairs still sleeping. And so deeply aware of what this next generation of young people are going to be like. One really quick thing about the network piece and like the over-training component, it's interesting because with Ignite, a lot of the core pieces of our theory of change is heavily around the network that young people need to have in order to start thinking about political leadership, whether that means that they're going to start to serve in their community as a campaign manager, or they're going to serve in their community on a local community board, and helping them start to understand how to connect those dots of my service to this is actually political and civic leadership, and as a through way to get to running for office. And then the other piece that Jennifer talked about with over training, I remember that one of our young women was getting ready to run her first race, and oh, I love your singing, honey, not right now. And my grandpa would like to participate with his Bluey song in this moment in time. He would have been in the room singing it, I guess, in real time. But this, like, I remember she was in the room, she was getting all of the training from Ignite, and then she was ready to go to the next training, and then the next day she was going to go to the next training, and she had like 4 different things on her docket that weekend. And I think it's one of those pieces about like wanting to have all of these different, both the networks, but also all these connections, because a lot of our young women come to us and they're like, I have no connections. I'm running for office because I care about something in my community, not because I have 10 different connections at City Hall or 10 different connections within my state. They're coming because they care so much about one thing or 10 things within their community. And so I think that that's an interesting piece that hasn't changed from millennials to even Gen Zers. And what we've seen at Ignite is that there's still this want and need to be able to have all of these different experiences in order to actually build their networks, because they are coming from communities that don't necessarily have fundraising, specifically fundraising networks for them to be able to tap into. And then I think what we're seeing on the ground right now from our high school, I was just on the ground at the Capitol here in California, in Sacramento, on Monday with 200 students ages 11 to 25. So the whole gamut of Gen Z. And what we're really seeing is that their new entry point into civic and political leadership is advocacy. So that one thing that they care most about, that is the thing that they are coming and wanting to learn more about, and they want to be able to enact action like right now. As we all know, policy takes forever. So it's not that it's going to happen, that the action is happening right now, but the long-term effect may not happen for another, I don't know, 2 to 3 years. But I think it's been very interesting to watch them continue to engage in the way that they are, given everything that they are experiencing on the ground on their campuses. I think when you're thinking about turning that advocacy into then running for office, what we're seeing is that it is taking a little bit longer to move them from advocacy into running for office, because of connecting those particular dots for them as they are engaging with their legislators. They're able to build that, but really getting them into this into the into those very city-specific positions, as they're thinking about school board, as they're thinking about the different commissions within their particular community. That's where we're able to translate a lot of what they're learning from advocacy into political leadership at the most local level. And I'm talking about like getting 18 and 17-year-olds on youth commissions and getting like 22 and 23-year-olds on school boards. We had a young woman come the other evening to our board meeting. She's 24 years old and is the youngest young woman to ever serve on the Minneapolis City Council. And she started working with Ignite back in 2017. And I just think about what Aura needed to hear in 2017. Her first engagement with us was with then State Rep Ilhan Omar and now Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who actually got to endorse her for her campaign. But all of the different steps she needed to take as a college student, building that network and building that community, and then ultimately being able to run, having done all of the legwork within her community to know the people that were there, and then ultimately be able to win her race.
So thank you, Sarah. And I think one of the things that I think is interesting, and I'd love to hear from either Jennifer or Traum about this, is as we talk about, connecting those dots between that leadership and advocacy and then connecting it to running for office and kind of what's the gap in between. Obviously, we heard a lot from Jennifer on self-perception as being kind of maybe one of those barriers there, and I loved how Council Member Louis Jean also talked about the difference between, being a leader versus being a principal. And I wonder kind of also too, in this self-perception of qualifications, of skills, of all of these things, how much of that is where we need to be focusing versus maybe some of these other pieces?
So I think that having all this training, I also did the Merge training and got endorsed by Emma's List, and I'm involved with several other organizations. Again, I think the gap here is not only getting people to think about running for office, but actually having organizations in place, more than Emily's List, like more local organizations in place to support women who are looking to run for office. Or if we're looking for people of color too, or other underrepresented groups, if you look around, there aren't many organizations, and that includes financial support. That includes making sure that they are working on legislation. In fact, I'm very proud to be a part of the Women's Caucus, and I know my colleague, Representative Joan Moschino, is a part of that, and also a Harvard Radcliffe alum. But we talk about this very often, about how laws can be barriers. So for instance, at the federal level, you can use childcare, campaign funds to pay for childcare. But
Which only happened in the last couple years.
Correct,
Yeah.
but we still don't have that in Massachusetts. So we need to fix these laws so that more people, parents, and underrepresented people can have that support system so that they can get into office. And then the other piece that people forget about is how expensive campaigns are outside of the donations, right? I had to take 7 months off out of my job, unpaid, to run for office because I worked for a nonprofit, got state funding, so there was a conflict of interest. So without the support system of my family, I would not have been able to do that. But I don't know how many people could say that they have that support system. So that was the perception. Going in, I had to think about, not only am I qualified, can I do this? Do I have the financial stability? Do I have the family support? Do I have the support of the community that I live in to be able to even get them to accept me as the candidate for the position? I was the very first person of color to represent my district at the time, and actually, I have a funny story to tell you about this. I was in my early 30s. I was campaigning in the middle of the summer, and of course, I wasn't wearing this. I was wearing a T-shirt with my logo on it and jeans. I came up to the door, and there's this older woman who answered the door, and she looked at me and she said, "Are you here to sell me Girl Scout cookies?" Like I was a lawyer. I don't know what else to tell you. But then there are also other people make you question your own qualifications, because I would go to the doors and they would ask me, "So what makes you think you're qualified to be a state representative?" And I would have to tell them I'm a lawyer, I've done work in court, I've also done legislative advocacy work, but also I'm running against a person who sells ice cream. Did you ask him if we were qualified when he was running for office? And so, I mean, nothing against small business owners, but it's just the perception of like, why are you questioning my qualification? I don't think you questioned his. And so I think it's both us working on ourselves to make to feel more confident in our abilities, but also we need to educate others that they should not question our competency to be in elected office.
So one thing I would note is that when we think about running for office, there really is a two-stage process, and you have to walk before you run. So it has to occur to you in the first place before you then encounter all of these other decision-making factors. And so I tend to focus in my research on that first step, like how does it even show up on your radar screen? And then you can make an actual assessment. You can have a cost-benefit analysis. You can figure out what you would need to make yourself have a competitive campaign. You can figure out what supports you would need if you were to win, election. The bigger barrier is, frankly, getting the idea to show up in your head in the first place. And that's, I think, the big, big challenge, because that's why we're seeing the increase in women's numeric representation. We know that when women run, they're doing as well, largely because these organizations are out there helping. The problem is getting them to that stage. And I think when I think about qualifications and when I think about the kinds of things and the kinds of messages we should be sending, and the idea that politics should at least be something you consider, I think about STEM. And there was a national and global outcry that women weren't going into math and science because we were squandering half of our global social capital. There's not that similar outcry when it comes to considering politics as a career, because politicians score lower than car salesmen on the ethics lists of various professions, right? Head lice poll higher than members of the US Congress in a popularity contest. This is a true story.
Wow.
And so, until we can sort of resurrect this idea, and it involves going back a long, long time, the idea that politics is a noble profession, that there are things that you can only do from elected office that you cannot do behind the scenes, until we realize that that's something that's valuable to impress upon our children, it becomes really, really difficult to figure out how we get women to the stage where they even encounter these kinds of organizations that can then help them run credible campaigns. So that's not to say that that second stage of the process isn't vital. It is. It's the reason that we actually get women elected. But who even reaches that second stage of the process is a broader societal problem that I don't think we've really begun to address.
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes back to the support systems, right? I think as, again, Council Member Louis Jean talked about, you know, at the root of kind of her deciding to run was also the support of her family, who emphasized public service, that it was a meaningful thing to enter into public service, which politics is public service. I know we don't always call it that, but it is. And you know, it's funny, in the conversations I've had over the years with women candidates, many candidates, but primarily women candidates, usually I would say the number one barrier that I hear from in talking with women is caregiving responsibilities. So to your point about the support system, can they feel it? And that's just not caregiving for children. It's oftentimes maybe for a sibling, oftentimes for a parent, or maybe it's both a parent and a sibling as one of those primary barriers. And so the support system piece, I think we also need to have some more structural changes. And you talked about one of them in terms of, you know, now childcare is something you can pay for the campaign, but I do think we need to look at more of those pieces that you already touched on. But I feel like that to me is one of the biggest pieces. And then also too, I think just how do we shape our communities, or how do we shape that broader public narrative that also then kind of supports women being in that position to say yes and to believe that they can say yes. And again, like, I know we've got our media narratives panel happening later today, but how much of this, Jennifer, you touched on this a little bit when you were looking at the Joni Ernst, or you were showing us some of the slides and the coverage, is maybe there's not being as much of a difference as we like to think there is. But I don't know if I think that felt counterintuitive to me. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, we don't think about things that aren't newsworthy, right? So the fact that most days of the week we're not covering what members of Congress are wearing is not a headline. Yeah. And so when we see egregious examples of sexism in politics, when we see ridiculous headlines regarding what women are wearing, that resonates with us. And because it is consistent with the way, I think 10, 20, and 30 years ago, women in politics were treated differently than men, we tend to think when we see these high-profile examples that that's still what it's like. And the fact that Chris Christie is called fat on a daily basis, and the fact that, you know, Ron DeSantis has, I'm sure, thrown away those boots, you know, that doesn't seem to matter, because that runs counter to the stereotype we have about coverage. And so I just think it's one of these things where, again, it's not to suggest that there aren't episodes of bias or discrimination or people saying sexist things or the media writing about things they shouldn't be writing about, but we tend to extrapolate from these very unusual high-profile examples and assume that all of that trickles down. And the good news is that it doesn't. I ran for Congress in 2006 in Rhode Island's 2nd Congressional District. I lost. I shouldn't have, but I took on an incumbent. But anyway, you know, for a long time after that race, I would go around talking about my experience, and I would tell these funny stories about how, you know, my favorite was on, you know, a couple days before the election, this woman came running up to me, and she's like, "Oh my gosh, you don't look nearly as fat in real life as you do on TV." And I said, "Thank you, because what else do you say?" But but a friend of mine said I should have said, "Oh, neither do you." But you know, I would tell that story, and the reason I was telling that story was because I was showing that, like, you know, at the beginning when I ran for office, I didn't think I would have thick enough skin to endure that. By the end, I just felt like, oh, wow, you weren't really raised very well, right? Like, and that you acquire these skills and these traits that you need. And I realized only within the last few years that by telling that story and not putting it in a broader context, I made it sound like that was happening on a daily basis, when in fact, that stands out to me because it happened once in a 16-month campaign. So I think that's part of the reason, and that's why we're sort of reluctant to embrace empirical evidence that sometimes suggests that systematically things are better than they might be.
Yeah. Sarah, I think I saw you raising your hand. Did you want to have something to add to that?
I just think it's so real. Like, I think that that's a core piece that, like, our young women are constantly facing as they're doing their campaigns. and as they're doing all their on the ground of like it's that one moment that they remember outside of the whole trajectory of the entire campaign that really marks their entire experience. And sometimes it's usually not a good thing. And so I wasn't necessarily raising my hand to for any piece, but I was just really thinking about that as one of the things that just keeps them going and that continues to fuel them. One of the things that Oren had said the other day was like, I just kept going because that's what they want me to do, is to stop. And so I'm just going to keep going. And then I ultimately won. And so I think that that's a big piece to think about of like, what does this next generation need to continue to keep going, because we need them.
Yeah, no, agreed. And I want to go, we're going to shortly go to some of the questions. Trom, did you want to add anything to that?
No.
Okay, so we're going to go now to some questions from our audience. Thank you for those who've been submitting. So we talked at the beginning about, I see a couple questions here about the pipeline, and is there any hope for broadening kind of the feeder careers that often lead to political candidacy? So whether, some of these things that we've already mentioned, any thoughts on that from the panel?
So for our 2021 study, we did broaden it. So the 2011 and 2001 studies were lawyers, business leaders, educators, and political activists. We had about 3,500 respondents in each of those. And so we did the same thing for 2021, and the gender gap was the same size. But then in 2021, we supplemented with an additional 2,500 people who came from any profession where they just worked full-time and had a college degree, because that's almost every single member of Congress, and it's about 94% of state legislators across the country meet that profile. And so the gender gap among those people was 15 percentage points instead of 16 points. So, I don't think this is a thing where if we're like, oh, let's just encourage people from outside professions to run, that we're gonna make systematically faster headway. The same kinds of barriers seem to apply. In fact, we wound up pooling the samples and combining them for the book that we're currently working on, because there were no real differences between the people in the feeder professions and everybody else.
I want to add to that. So we need to be more intentional about who we're recruiting from. So before, when I first got into office, I typically would go into a government class to talk to young people and talk about running for office. But going to your point, most of those government classes were male-dominated. And so recently, I've been going to the healthcare profession, educators, those that I know are predominantly women, and talking to them about, you don't have to be a lawyer. You don't have to be from any of these, feeder backgrounds or majors in order to run for office. We, in fact, want people from very different backgrounds, because diversity and representation makes for more innovative solutions. And so, and that's intentionality we're talking about. And also, in terms of recruiting interns, I'm very intentional about trying to get more women into the State House as interns. And going back to the Women's Caucus, we also provide support for women staffers and others to try to get them to see themselves in these positions. And Massachusetts is still lingering at around 31% women. And so, and actually, I was looking at my numbers, I'm 207 ever to serve in the legislature. And you know how many men? 20,000 plus. And so there's a lot of work to be done. And that's why we're very intentional about bringing these women in, so they can see young women in, so they can see how the legislature works. And we know that staffers or interns tend to then later on think about running for office. And those are some of the intentional ways that I've been trying to build on that pipeline. And also I've been working with national organizations to actually go out there into community, to go to community organizers and try to identify people who we could encourage personally to run. And I serve as a mentor to them. They may not be ready now, but I want them to know that if they need someone to talk to get them to that place, or once they make that decision, they have a sounding board so they don't feel alone in making that decision.
Yeah, no, I think mentorship is one of the most valuable ways that you can make that tangible difference. I think it's more of a lasting difference. One thing, though, that I want to go back to is what you were saying in terms of, where are we recruiting from and going outside like the traditional paths. Do you think, we've got a question here about, asking about what role do the political parties play in either perpetuating or closing that gender gap, especially in terms of this recruitment efforts? What are we seeing from the political parties in terms of that? And I'll say, I know when you showed the data point on the U.S. Congress, the thing that occurred to me, and obviously I worked in the Congress for quite a while, is that in the Democratic caucus, it's a majority-minority caucus, and it is, I want to say we're almost at like 50%.
40%.
Yeah, women. And so that's very different than the overall statistics. So I know on the Dem side, I know there's been a lot of work there. But can you, anyone, Sarah or Jennifer, want to address the political party difference?
It's bad. I mean, but it's not that surprising when you think about the Democratic Party has been, for research that Danny Hayes, who's at GW, and I have done about what happens when women run for Congress, we did interviews with Democratic and Republican Party leaders in DC. And I mean, when you walk into the DNC, I don't know if anybody's been there, it's like one of those old Benetton commercials where it literally just looks like a ton of people from every race and background holding hands, singing Kumbaya, and talking about how they're gonna fix the world. And it's so empowering, and you walk in, you just sort of feel so good. And we had interviewed somebody there, and she said, look, you know, when we think about who we're recruiting, diversity and inclusivity is one of our top 3 factors. And we think that that sets us apart as a party, so it's a strategic advantage, but we also think it's the right thing to do. And so it's implicit in the way that they go about their business that they don't only want white men to run for office. We went to the Republican headquarters, and it's a very different situation over there. And you know, part of the issue is that Republicans in general don't subscribe to notions of identity politics. And so identifying anybody by any gender or race or specific sociodemographic characteristics sort of flies in the face of a lot of those values. But the other thing that I'll say is, they were pretty straightforward in telling us that if there's a woman who's able to self-fund and win in her district, they want her. But like, they want to be active and they want to win in as many districts as they can. And the thing that was really interesting to me was, unlike the Benetton footage, we were in somebody's office and he had 15 of these huge poster size, they're framed posters, and they were members of Congress who had been up in competitive seats the previous election cycle. They were all Democrats, and 12 of them had these huge red X's through them, and they were framed. And those were the people that were defeated by Republicans. It was, you know, Republicans took back those seats. And they said that when they think about running, and when they think about recruiting candidates, they look at who they think they can knock off, and then they go to that district, and they look at people who have a history of being able to raise money in that district, who tend to be statewide elected officials or state legislators who happen to be men, and then they recruit from there. And so part of the issue here is not necessarily the fact that like the Republicans are biased and don't want to support women. When Republican women run, they do just as well. But when we think about the calculus that plays into who gets recruited and the pools from which they're recruiting, the Democrats are casting a much wider net.
Yeah, and everybody loves a self-funder, I think, too. I mean, that certainly makes it easy.
But there are women out there who can do that.
Oh, for sure.
Like, so if you, Mitt Romney took a hit when he had his binders full of women comment. But the reality is we need binders full of women. Like, don't put the women in the binder, put the resume in the binder. Like if the Republican and Democratic parties wanted to, like quite literally, if they decided that heading into 2024, there are 22 toss-up seats. So 11 are currently held by Democrats, 11 are currently held by Republicans. 10 of the ones held by Republicans are held by men. 6 of the seats held by Democrats are held by men. If the Democratic and Republican parties each recruited strategically a woman to run in each of those contests, and each candidate had a 50% chance of winning, we would, in those 22 races alone, see a net increase of 2% women in Congress. 22 races could actually shift the percentage of women serving in Congress by 2%. So we're not talking about having to go out there and find 870 women to run in every single congressional district. And so maybe we don't even need binders full of women. We just need like a folder full of women. And we can make pretty significant progress.
Oh my gosh, I love that. So
don't quote me on that ever.
I know. So we have another question that actually goes back to what we were talking about before related to mentorship, Trom, and what you mentioned. And the question is about what is your advice for identifying your mentor and what should the mentee ask of them in this context?
I think the mentorship relationship should be fluid because different people need different things. So I wouldn't give a formula for this, but looking for a mentor who share your values, looking for a mentor who has the time and who's invested in you as a person. And I say that too, even now as, you know, I'm now the highest ranking Asian American woman in the legislature, but I also still need a mentor to move up into leadership. So it's someone who's looking to invest in you long term as well. It's not just to get into office, but how to continue to be a sounding board and build that network for you. I came here to the US when I was 5 years old as political refugees with my family, and we grew up in poverty, so I didn't have the network until I went to law school and then to now at Harvard. And so my mentors through the years have really built out that network for me. So I've identified that as a core piece of what you should look for in a mentor who can open those opportunities for you. And so I think those.
Yeah, no, thank you. And Sarah, I actually have a question for you from someone in the audience around, you know, especially in young women, so whether we're talking about mentorship or whether we're talking about recruitment and training, and this question is basically around, you know, young women having safety issues, having perception issues as one of their primary concerns about running. Do you see that in the young women that you're talking to, that there are concerns around safety, around exposure, especially in the media, which I think is one of the things that probably is most off-putting to people, as we saw from some of Jennifer's research in terms of, you know, not wanting the attention or not wanting kind of the 24/7 following. I think we've seen that with a lot of, you know, members of Congress, certainly, especially somebody like Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who, you know, or Ilhan Omar, who was mentioned, who consistently receive death threats, you know, who consistently are kind of stalked and harassed by constituents. Do you see the safety concerns playing out in the women you're talking to?
Totally. I mean, I think it's not just a concern, it's a reality that our young women are facing. And like our young women demographic are over 70% young women of color. And so as they are starting to think about what it means to lead in their communities and to support their communities, it's not, they didn't think their neighbor was gonna like go after them or be their opponent or like not be somebody that would be supportive of them. And so I think that's the most interesting piece as they're navigating what their races look like, is that they just didn't anticipate that, you know, George from down the block was actually gonna be an opponent to what their campaign was gonna look like. And I think they're facing it. I think they're facing it in their communities and also on social media. And as social media has become a driving force for a lot of digital organizing for our young women, they're seeing it from like just political ads and not in their content not being seen all across the board, or just the different conversations that are happening to address them as candidates as they are running for office. And I think they're facing it. I think the big piece that is helping them power through it, obviously there's like the first moment that makes it really, that is probably the most challenging, or it depends on like how personal the particular attack is. When one of our young women ran and won her mayoral election, she's the youngest young woman to serve in California as mayor, as the youngest woman of color to serve as mayor in the state of California. And the first headline for her the day after was, "Can the single mother do it?" And so leading up to the election, there was a lot of different conversations around it, but I think that the messaging is really challenging, and they're definitely facing it. And I think the network that they've built within their time at Ignite and with the other organizations that they're a part of, and then obviously leaning back into their community, has been a core piece to, as a core driver, but it definitely makes the campaign process really challenging. And it's hard too, because you're trying to figure out the navigation of what does it look like from a digital sphere versus what it looks like just within your own community.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's very sobering. And I know we've got time for probably, I think, one more question. And I want to end on a high note. We've talked about a lot of challenges, but I think there's also a lot of opportunities. And one of the questions that we have from the audience is about asking to share any success stories or strategies from countries, other countries, or from communities here where women's participation in politics has significantly increased. So any thoughts from any of our panelists about a success story or someone you would point to as kind of this was a great way that they did it, or lessons that we can take from the way somebody did something?
Well, I'm always proud to be from Massachusetts, where 4 of our 5 constitutional offices are now held by women. We have, yes, that's right. So I think we are doing something right here, and it is about having leadership and others who think about these things constantly, and about going into the communities and getting people to get on that ladder of engagement. And I think that that is key. When I campaigned for the first time, I was told I had a 30% chance of winning. So I was like, you know what, let's just run and see how it goes. But the reason why I won with 55% of the votes was we went door to door throughout the entire district twice and got people who never voted before to then vote, and then get those people to then volunteer for the campaign. And some of my volunteers have gone on to run for local office or other offices. And it's those little pieces that all add up to, hopefully moving the needle a little bit. And just supporting organizations that like Ignite and others in the local communities, where they can help identify people and connect us with women and non-binary people who are looking to run, so that we can provide that, whether that's support or mentorship or other resources that they may need.
Wonderful. Anything to add to that, Jennifer?
I mean, I guess what I would say is we have really made such significant headway when it comes to women's representation that when I wrote the first book, it was called It Takes a Candidate, Why Women Don't Run for Office. And then when we wrote the follow-up, it was It Still Takes a Candidate, Why Women Don't Run for Office. It turns out now women are running for office, but the gender gap in political ambition is still there. So the title of this book is It Takes More Than a Candidate, Closing the Gender Gap in Political Ambition. And so, I focus today on how we now have this new crisis, and it's that we need to close this gender gap in ambition. But 20 years ago, the crisis was that, we had literally half as many women serving in Congress as we do today. And so I think, you can be glasses half full or glasses half empty. I'm always glasses entirely empty. But putting on that optimistic hat for a minute, we really have made significant strides, and now the goal is to just figure out how to make sure that those strides trickle down and open up this general sense of political equity and inclusion more broadly.
Thank you, Sarah. Any parting words on this?
Yeah, I'll share a quick story. I met a young woman named Carla Garcia when she was 14. She was a student at a high school that we were working with in Dallas, Texas. Carla had an awesome project for her policy capstone in high school around how to understand how young girls were not going to get pregnant in high school, and what that epidemic was looking like in Dallas. She presented her entire project to the school board. They were like, "This is fabulous," but no. And this is really cute of you. So she went to college, she came back, she ran for school board, won her runoff, and then ultimately served on the school board as the youngest Latina to ever serve. And she was elected in 2018. And I love this photo of her as literally the center of the school board. She was the only one to serve on the school board as a prior student. And it was amazing to really think about what she was then able to do. And so I think a lot of the experiences that our young women are facing that are deeply impacting them are also leading to this kind of change. And she really stuck to it and ultimately had to help students get out of the classroom due to COVID and then figure out how to get them back in, but really clear and just confident in what she was able to do as a young person, navigating those challenges as a 24-year-old. And so I'm hopeful that there's Carla, and there are 35,000 other young Carlas across the country that Ignite has been able to train and start to fill and build that pipeline for stage one of what Jennifer has been talking about, to really help us get to this next generation of political leadership.
I think that's wonderful, and I want to encourage as we close the panel, and I'm so thankful to the co-panelists here today for joining us and everything that you all have shared with us. And what I would encourage everybody who's watching online, all of you in the audience, I would challenge everybody to normalize and make it a regular part of your lives, maybe to ask women, would you run for office? Like this question, and just, whether it's like at the bar, at the grocery store, to really like think about this, normalize just as you're talking to people, asking them, have you ever thought about it? And really encouraging that, because I think I take it for granted. I probably don't do it enough, even in my own friend group, right, is think about that. But I do think that the more we kind of normalize it, the more we change that perception, I think the better off we're all going to be on maybe breaking through some of these things. So thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for the panel.
But with that, you all should consider running.
Yes. Does anybody here want to run for office? Thank you so much.
That was beautifully moderated. Thank you, Jennifer, for setting us off with those great remarks. And thank you, Tram and Sarah. That really was fantastic. And some of the things that really stood out to me were, one, just the importance of intentional support and mentorship. Another key theme was strategic efforts to increase representation. And then building on Ruth C's comments this morning, the importance of allyship, so others helping women along the way. We are going to take a break now, just for a few minutes. Thank you all for your attention so far. So we're going to come back right at 10:55. Before we break, I do just want to point out that we are joined by Joan Machino, who's a state representative from the 3rd Plymouth District. So I encourage you all to say hello during the break, and we're going to come back here at 10:55. Thanks so much for a great morning so far.